what's up? Welcome to another episode of Wassup Conversations. This time, I have a very special guest. Someone I admire a lot, and I think that her career is a great inspiration for all the girls and boys around the world. She's not in the game development business, but she's someone who tells us about them, and she does it really good.
Straight from the top.
Ladies and gentlemen, my guest is no one but IGN's editor-in-chief, Tina Amini. Tina is an absolute joy to talk to, and in this episode, we talk about everything. Tina's career, childhood, favorite games, next gen, industry, IGN, and the future of journalism, and so many more. And oh yeah, Tina is a Persian, just like yours truly. Okay, let's get it done. Wassup Conversations is on YouTube and video, and you can listen to the podcast on all the major podcast streaming services such as Spotify and Apple Podcasts. To keep up with the podcast and get to know more about my guests, follow me on Twitter at hrnikufar or on Instagram at amidrezanikufar. And you can always get more from my website www.nikufarmusic.com. Thanks for listening. Let's give Tina a warm what's up. Hello and welcome to Wassup Conversations, Tina. So good to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. So how's everything? How are you dealing with the pandemic?
You know, it's been difficult for everybody, I think. But I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to come out to Austin, Texas. I was previously in San Francisco, California, where IGN's headquarters are. But once our office is locked down, I decided, why stay in San Francisco where I'm all alone? And I came to Austin where my two older brothers live, and my niece and my nephew. And then they have two more on the way too. So it's good to be by family at the very least.
That is great. So I gotta tell you this. We were working on our debut trailer for Nasser Son of Man to show it at Gamescom. So I was like, it would be awesome if IGN premiered this. So I contacted you guys and the response I got was amazing. You guys were excited about the game and helped us a lot introducing this little indie game to the world. It's interesting because people are constantly asking you, what did you do so they premiered the game? What's the secret? How much did you pay? And the truth is, you guys are gamers. You see a good game and you try to share it with the world. And that's the healthiest way a video game website could operate, I guess. So it benefits the indie developer, website, and most importantly, the audience. And even with my own podcast, Wassup Conversations, I remember IGN reported a news from my chat with Arjan Hanbeck, the art director of Gears 5, regarding something about Gears 6. And you guys took the time to introduce my podcast and what I do with it. And it meant so much because other websites were like, hey, this is the news. And yeah, the source is this podcast. So what I'm trying to say is that you guys love and support games, no matter if it's a AAA game or indie or if it's even a podcast. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Our pleasure. I mean, we have such a good opportunity and a platform to be tastemakers to help introduce people to new and interesting games. There are so many games out there. And we partner, with Colin Messe for Gamescom. We do a lot of work around E3. So why not use those big events, those big opportunities to help shine a light on some things that we feel like are interesting too, that we feel like our readers might like too. And definitely the way that Gamescom works is that we have a couple of us now through the pandemic in a hangout like this, and we just go through trailers together, and that one struck all of us immediately. We loved the art style. The gameplay looked really interesting and unique and fun. And the trailer spoke for itself too, because there's an art to creating trailers as well. So all of that was just, a great package, and, we had a great space for it in Gamescom, so it worked out very well. So it's genuinely our pleasure. And as content creators, we value the fact that you put so much of your work into it. And so the shout outs and the backlinks and whatnot is definitely something we're happy to do all the time.
Oh, thank you so much. So I've been in contact with you during the Gamescom, and I was so impressed with your professionality handling lots of things. It was like watching Thor playing with his hammer. It was that smooth and badass. In this podcast, I talk to people that inspire me, and I try to inspire the whole world by these conversations. And I thought it would be amazing to have you on the show to talk about your life in order to If hopefully inspire all girls around the world dreaming of becoming the next Tina Amini. So let's go back to the pre-apocalyptic world. Let's talk about your childhood growing up with games. Where were you born, and tell me about the early days.
Sure. So I was born in New York, where I spent the majority of my life, frankly, until I moved to California. So I'm a New Yorker through and through. But given that I have two older brothers, I definitely played to the younger sister role. So, I was fighting over the controller, like, no, you get out of the way. I can do this better than you. Let me show you how it's done, kind of like gamer talk conversation, which is funny because now my brothers have nothing to do with video games. One's a programmer, so semi related in a certain field. But other than that, I was the one that actually took the mantle and turned video games into a big part of my life and obviously my entire career now. So we played a lot of games at our cousins' houses. They lived in Boston, and we would do road trips over to Boston because they were the ones that had the systems. The system I remember playing the most was the SNES because that was the one that they had out. It had a couple multiplayer games. We played GoldenEye round after round after round, and that was the one where they actually let me have the controller because there were a couple more players that could participate. So it was a little bit more fair. But my parents were a little bit against screens, as they called it. And so they didn't want us having access to consoles. So our only opportunity was when we were visiting our cousins or when we eventually got older and just, found a way to buy our own consoles and get out of the parental purview that limited us at the time.
Yeah. So did you always wanted to work in the video game industry?
No, I actually didn't realize until I was in college. And I didn't even realize I wanted to go in any sort of writing field. I knew that I liked the entertainment industry and the media industry. So I went to NYU and I specialized in media and communication and culture, which is interesting because media is so much a part of communicating with people, but also, sharing in a culture and communicating about that culture, whether it's the culture of video games or whatever your topic that you're pursuing is. So it was something that I knew I peripherally liked. I loved TV shows and movies as well. So like the entertainment field was something I was very interested in. And then I had a couple professors grade a couple of my papers, and a few of them took the time to actually write, like, have you considered writing as a career? And it was the first time I'd ever considered it. So I thought, like, maybe I should. And at the time when I was in college, I was picking up, jobs here and there and internships, always, wanting to pursue the field of what could be my career and experiment in that way to find out what might suit my needs and my desires. And I landed on a couple of internships at magazines, but the thing that I really enjoyed doing was I started reading about video games rather than just playing them. And one of the websites that I followed, it's a smaller website. It's called Gaming Nexus. Great group of writers and editors, and all of them are working basically for free, for pro bono, just because it's their passion. So it's a website that they made together. They had an opening for a writer, and on a whim, I reached out. And they accepted me right away. And one of my first preview events, my big first preview event was Dragon Age Origins, the first Dragon Age. And they flew me to Edmonton, Canada for a week. And I played that game for a week. And it was the most amazing experience. Totally spoiled me because that's not how previews go. You don't sit there for a week playing, an RPG that you're going to eventually fall in love with. And at the time, they actually promised us our save games. It didn't end up working out, but the prospect was very interesting. So that we could continue to play our characters when the game formally came out. But I loved it from that moment on, and I felt like that was the first time that I could actually nerd out about video games to other people who whose eyes didn't glaze over after the first introduction or two. So I felt like I found my space and my community, and I was still in college at the time. I continued to write with Gaming Nexus. And then when I graduated, eventually I found a full-time job that could sustain, a salary and whatnot, and moved on from Gaming Nexus, but always have fond memories of having worked there and really learned the ropes there too.
So how did your parents react to the early days of your career?
They've always been very proud of me, just in the sense of they know like my work ethic. They might not understand the video game industry, but they know me very well. And I was always a straight A student, perfect Persian girl, of course. So they were always very proud of those things that they understood. And I think the thing that really clicked for them when they could get a measure of, what being successful in this career looks like is when I showed up on certain mainstream TV channels and networks, like MSNBC, if they invited me on as a panelist to talk about why Candy Crush was doing so well, because those are the topics they're interested in. That resonated with my parents because they could just as easily turn the TV on and happen to see their daughter on something that they consume on a regular basis. And their friends would say, like, I just turned the TV on and there's Tina. So I think that really is when it clicked for them, when they saw how many, TV opportunities I was getting and where my byline was showing up and some of the event work that we were doing. So anytime that I can point to something where they can watch me on camera, they're always happy to see how professional I've become, they would say.
This is awesome. So back when you started working in media, did you ever imagine yourself become the editor-in-chief of probably the biggest entertainment website in the world? Was it something feasible back then? Were there people saying that, oh, it's not going to work, you're making a mistake or something?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you never think too far in advance. You always have prospects for what you want to grow in. And so when I first started, I knew I wanted to find my voice because as a writer, you have ideas and you have an idea of what your voice may be, especially when you're young in college and figuring this stuff out. So I knew the first steps I wanted to make were, let me develop my voice a little bit more. Let me develop my editing skills more. And then it became, let me develop my managing skills. So all of these things are natural progressions from one point of your career to the next. But I never dreamed of becoming the editor-in-chief of IGN. Even when I came to interview for the role, they flew me out. I was in LA at the time, and they flew me out to San Francisco. And I remember calling one of my brothers in the airport, and I was telling them like how amazing the interview was, which is a rare scenario where you actually, you're talking to people, and most of the time you're so focused on, you're nervous, like, what am I going to say? How am I presenting myself? But I actually really enjoyed talking to the people that were interviewing me, because IGN is very known for bringing a lot of people in front of new candidates because our operation is so big. And so we want you to meet a lot of people and a lot of people to meet you. So I met a lot of people in the process, and so many of them asked really thoughtful questions, like really made me think about how to answer them. And so it felt like this is a group of very talented people who think a lot about their work, and I want to work with them and help them do the things that they're envisioning for themselves. And I told my brother, like, just the fact to be considered was amazing. And it felt amazing. I said, even if I don't get the job, alone on its own, to be considered for this role felt like an achievement already. And sure enough, it worked out. So obviously it's an even more enjoyable moment to have gotten the job as well, like being surprised by it. But yeah, you never start off with that as the goal, but it's amazing to be here now that I finally am.
It's awesome. So, Tina, you've been in this business for quite some time now with Mashable, Complex, Kozaku, and IGN. What do you think has changed the most in the media and the world of journalism and video games for the past 10 years, for example? And where do you see it going?
A lot has changed. I think probably the most obvious one is that so many people are having communications and they're developing communities on other platforms. So it's no longer IGN.com, it's Twitter.com/IGN, and it's our YouTube channel and our Snapchat channel and our Instagram channel. So there's so many more platforms where you have to think about what your audience there is looking for, how best to represent the news and the features and the reviews that you do, but also offer them a different space, like what memes can you participate in that is the language of Instagram that people want, but with that video game edge and knowledge. There's different areas and different audiences to speak to. So that's a big one where we have a huge social team, to credit for all of the work that they're doing on all of those platforms. And they're tasked with the responsibility of thinking, what is the best format for each of these platforms and for each of those differences in those audiences? So that's a major one. But I'd say more just in terms of the content itself. I think community in general has become so much more important. There's a lot that is happening in the community in terms of their reactions to a trailer or to a video game release or to a publisher purchase or a new hardware release. Like those reactions, I think, are a lot of times a part of the news cycle, because you're seeing how the gaming community is responding to things. You're seeing what's important to them. And then for my editors, it's very much about what are the questions that they're asking and how do we make sure that we're answering those? Because in overall, like the purpose of IGN is supposed to be a resource and a service to its audience. So if there are questions out there, we want to be able to answer them, or at least help bring everyone together on our community pages so that they can think about those questions and their opinions around them on our platforms too.
Exactly, and I really love the current IGN. I've never been attached to a certain website, but I feel there is this circle, this coherent connectivity involved in IGN right now that it gives me a lot about games I like or the topics I'm interested in. And this mostly comes from IGN's rich coverage and different social networks. IGN is not just a website anymore; it's more like a presence. It's there when I open my Instagram, my Twitter, or YouTube, and I think this presence and connectivity became much deeper when you stepped in. The idea of leading a subject or a game with news and then going deeper in the other forms is something that I've heard and seen you rely on a lot. Talk about your ideas about this new way of approaching news and eventually reaching more people.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very much about having your finger on the pulse when it comes to just what the conversations are that are out there, what matters to people, and obviously we have access to developers and publishers and PR, so we can be that connective, that connective channel between what the community is interested in. And that goes for, okay, well, we know, Elden Ring is top of mind because I was just reading a story of ours from one of our freelancers about Elden Ring and a subreddit community. So that's actually a perfect example because he looked at, okay, we haven't seen anything about Elden Ring in many years now. And we know that the Elden Ring fan base is out there. And so what they've taken to doing now is making up their own lore, and they'll actually submit pictures and full background stories and like, here's how it's going to work out in the game. And it's an amazing space where people have, they've accepted like, okay, it's going to be a minute before we hear anything about this game, but we're very excited. We want to participate in these communications. And then the IGN structure on that side is to look at something interesting and fun that's going on that you or I may otherwise never have stumbled on. But because, we have our finger on the pulse and we have freelancers and our features editors who are thinking about these things, where it's reflexive to say like, this is an interesting story. And even if you're not an Elden Ring fan, you're probably someone who spends time on the internet. And so this is the other part of this interesting story is the way that people are gathering and communing and finding a space to still maintain the conversation, even when there's no new news beats. So sometimes the lack of news is the news. And in this case, it was very much a part of the Elden Ring story and actually even a part of the next gen story. We're about a month out from the consoles releasing. We have an Xbox Series X. We don't have a PS5, and it's just sort of unheard of. Even hearing the price and the date so late in the game, that lack of news became the news. Where like we're about to approach this new generation, but we haven't heard anything. Our fans are desperate for more information, and so are we. And so that becomes part of the conversation, essentially.
Exactly. So last night I was talking to someone from the marketing team of CD Projekt Red. He said that he still believed that media has the most influence in marketing a game, and I believe in that too. I was thinking about the whole review system back in the old days. People would read a review to see if a game is worth their money to buy. With services like Xbox Game Pass, free-to-play games, and the streaming services, I think not a lot has changed. Gamers still watch and read reviews to see the game is worth their time to play, because there are infinite amount of games out there, and I'm just talking about solid opinion of a website after its release as a review. What do you think about all this, about customers relying on a website, for example IGN, to invest money or time on a game?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for us, it's very much about, and in my other outlets that I've worked at too, the consistent thing is that we're not necessarily proposing, should you pay for this game? Because everyone comes from a different financial position. Games cost different prices in different regions occasionally. So that's something that we have to consider, that we may not know the context for which you're operating. So we can't necessarily recommend whether you buy the game, but we can recommend whether we feel like it's worth your time in playing. So that's a different kind of cost value there. And one that we feel a little bit more suited to express in a genuine way. So it's about, is there something unique that this is presenting? What does it do well versus what doesn't it do well? So that you can really think like, You know what? I hate weapon breaking systems, and I just don't, even though the reviewer, so you have to read everything with a grain of salt, where like maybe the reviewer feels like it's an extra challenge, it forces you to go out and explore, and it's totally okay to have a weapon breaking system. But for me, once I find a weapon that I like, I sort of stick to it. I have maybe the 3 that I'll swap between for the differences in enemies, but otherwise I feel very much a connection to certain weapons when I've decided this is the one that I like. I know how to maneuver around with this one. So for me, if I'm reading a review where the reviewer says that there's a weapon breaking system and expresses how extensive it is within the game, and for them, they say, you know what, it's fine. But I can read into the information half of that and say, well, I know for me, I don't like the weapon breaking system. So for me, it would bring the score, the value of putting my time into the game a little bit lower. So I think you start to develop a rapport too with writers and bylines. And I think it's really important to remember bylines, because you can think, Tina loves Borderlands and she loves Left 4 Dead, and just random examples off the top of my head. So I know, our tastes align. She's reviewed those games really highly. So I know to look at her reviews in the future in a way that, understands what kind of games I'm looking for. So it's all very personal. But, you're right that there's been a lot of changes in the industry. We've been introducing more reviews in progress, and more, reviewer AMAs, so that we can kind of work with the timeline that's been introduced, because there's early access games and beta games, and they're available, and oftentimes you pay for them to have that access. So we always still try to make sure that we have that opinion out there. The second that it's something that you're able to partake in or pay for, we want to make sure that we give you some metric of value, from our point of view, so that you're informed going in, even if it's having to read things through the lens of your own opinions and interpretation of things, which everyone absolutely should do.
Yeah. So how do you come up with new ideas? I mean, based on what criteria you decide to change something or add a new feature to the website? What's your process?
So these days, I mean, it's different, right? Like every phase, there's something that you're really focused on. And these days, I'm personally really focused on community. So some of that is what I've already spoken to in terms of looking at it from a news perspective, from what questions we're asking, what games that we're highlighting, if we know that there's a big interest in one versus another. But I think we have a whole product team at IGN as well, and we've introduced polls where you can vote. Are you going to buy the PS5? Are you going to buy the Xbox Series X? Sometimes we turn the results of those polls into news stories themselves, like 50% of gamers are going to buy a PS5 and an Xbox Series X. Just random statistics and facts like that. It's always interesting to engage your audience and then turn what they're feeling and they're saying and they're thinking into content that reflects back at them. That's one of the examples. So there's a lot of other product details that we're working on, or new formats. We experimented with what we call micro reviews, which is basically we have the official review from the official reviewer, and then the other staff members that may have completed a game who may want to give their own score and their own reasoning for it, because we felt like people love hearing other people's opinions too. We often do that in our podcast. So why not try it in a review format? I think that comes with its pros and its cons. So we always have to see how an idea develops and see, is this something that the readers want? What are the problems with it? What are the problems with it that the readers have introduced? Is that a problem we can solve? Or do we feel like, it's a negligible problem? We still want to move forward with the idea because it's ultimately still a positive experience. So there's always experiments going on. And it's always in service of what is the best thing for the reader. And a big thing that I would love to introduce that we've been talking around is categorization, so that you can say, I only want to read about first-person shooters. So I'm going to tick this box and I'm only going to get information on first-person shooters. We cover a wide range of topics. We even cover, we cover movies and TV shows, anime and comic books, and even science and tech stories. So there's a wide breadth of content that we have. But if you really don't like TV shows, like my oldest brother, he hates TV shows for whatever reason. He hates getting sucked into the cycle, essentially. So he might, tick everything but TV shows. And then that would be the perfect IGN experience for him. Because we sometimes see, why is this the fifth PS5 story that I'm reading about? Well, because our traffic indicates the overall community is very interested in PS5 stories. So we want to service that part of our readership. And there might be a vocal minority that feels like, I don't care about the PS5, actually. I'm just here to read about games. I don't care about the hardware. So then they can filter that out. So that's something that, we're constantly thinking about, and that would be a big lift. And our product team has a lot of other things that they're working on in the process. So it's always kind of about what's the best user experience ultimately at the end of the day, which is often, what game developers also think about.
Yeah. So you mentioned about PS5 and Xbox. Which one are you most interested in?
I don't know, both, because it's tough for journalists, because you're always going to get both. There's no question about it. I have 2 pre-orders on hold, one for each for myself. So it's different when it comes from our perspective, because it's part of the job to make sure that you're maintaining balance, and that you're you're knowledgeable enough on both. So it's tricky for a journalist to answer that question. But I will say that I started off as an Xbox girl, and then I had actually the very first console that I owned myself was a PS2, as opposed to borrowing from cousins or borrowing from my brothers. The PS2 was my very first and my only console at the time. So I have a lot of affection for that console. But then I became an Xbox girl because I loved Halo and I loved playing with my friends online. So that became the pinnacle of my college experience. And then I transitioned to the PS4 because all my friends went to the PS4, because at the time that the conversation was, oh, well, the graphics are ever so slightly better on PS4. So let's just opt to get the game on PS4 versus Xbox when possible. And then that became the platform where all your friends were. So inevitably you stuck to it. You're playing Destiny on PS4, The Division on PS4, Borderlands. Like, those are all the experiences when there's multiplayer element that you will choose the PS4 again, because that's where a lot of your friends are playing and spending their time too. But this is an opportunity for that potentially to shift. So I think I need to see, is this big ZeniMax Bethesda purchase that Xbox made, like, what does that rollout look like? What other purchases might they have up their sleeve? They're very about, open platform and not making things locked to the Xbox Series X, whereas Sony is a little bit more about, oh, the PS5 is this brand new experience we want to introduce to you. So I think it remains to be seen where people will spend most of their time and which one has the best value for your experience. So who knows, we might transition back to the Xbox being the dominant platform of choice, but it's going to require games to come out and the consoles to come out and people to play on them to see, where do you want your multiplayer experience to be from there.
Awesome. No love for PC, huh?
I
was waiting for a Henry Cavill answer from you. PC.
Well, that is, part of the Xbox experience. They're very open to everything coming out on the PC too. And I think, the PC is something that I respect and to just totally can't handle on my own, in the sense of, I've moved around a lot in the last few years, and it's this other, new big bulky piece of equipment, one that you have to take care of a little bit more. And I'm much more about, okay, what's the quick system that I don't have to spend too much time in? If I was a smarter gamer, I would certainly be a PC gamer. But I opt for the lazy route, essentially, where it's just a plug and play feeling kind of system.
All right, let's talk about this movement against the workplace abuses and some misbehaviors in the video game industry. People are coming forward and they're talking about the horrible things happening in video game companies. It looks like it is helping. For example, Ubisoft is trying to change a lot. At least that's what they're telling. How do you see the future of this movement? And do you think media could and should interfere?
I mean, yeah, in the sense of reporting on those truths, that's absolutely, within the purview of something that we should be doing and using our platform for good to be highlighting when there are instances that we know of that, are things that we should be decrying. So absolutely, there's a responsibility there when it comes to the media to make sure we're shining a light on some of these examples. As far as, influencing in any other direction, I think it's really about highlighting what we feel like is the wrong thing, what we feel like is the right thing, what we feel like is working, what we feel like is not working, so that it's giving a sense of guidance, but, not necessarily like coming in as a consultant. Like, there are consultants that you can hire in those industries that come in outside of HR, who can look at your processes and look at your leadership and see, what are your philosophies? What are the written down philosophies versus what are the philosophies culturally that you're sort of tacitly explaining and having people accept, where they realize it's just embedded in the culture and not necessarily your cleaned up, buttoned up policies that are written down on a piece of paper somewhere that are handed out, on your onboarding day and kind of forgotten about afterwards. So it's about, making sure that people are acknowledging that and holding to their word, and then calling it out when it's not being held to their word, essentially. I do empathize. I know that like in big companies, it's difficult to have a purview of everything. I think you see it in a lot of different industries. You saw it with Ellen DeGeneres recently, and she comes from a very specific platform where that's a lot of her philosophy is against what some of those workplace abuses that were reported coming out from her show and her project. And I don't. It's difficult to say where the truth is because obviously Ellen DeGeneres says I wasn't aware. And, as some people can say, well, it's your responsibility to be aware because you're a manager in this position. But I can see it being feasible that she wasn't aware. So I think it's about, making sure that media is calling it out, but also the people who work in those industries, in those companies are also calling it out because you may have the star of your show who's unaware of some of those workplace practices because she's so busy doing whatever it is that her day-to-day is in terms of scripting and researching and interviewing people and working with her leads and making sure that you're flagging things and giving people the opportunity to make corrections because it's culture can rapidly develop if it's left unchecked. And then it becomes a reflexive part of the nature of a company. And so if you're not constantly checking in on those things and asking the right questions, it can turn into something that's just accepted. And if there are people at the top that are enforcing it, who are half the other people under them to say anything where there's a level of fear or, for your job stability or just of, people ostracizing you for your opinion, for speaking out. So I think, everybody needs to sort of acknowledge that. And I'm in a way, I'm proud that the industry is coming to this reckoning because I think we've seen horrible things coming out of the Hollywood industry. I think the tech industry has a lot more reckoning in front of it. I think there's a lot of unspoken scenarios there, just from what I kind of know from casual conversations and whatnot, which is very different from report-worthy conversations, of course. So I think there's just a culture in the industry in general, and as long as there are industries that are finding it important and people in the periphery of that industry, which media is reporting on that industry rather than the industry, as long as those people are also calling it out and calling it out as something important, and not just letting statements go by, making sure that I always say like actions speak louder than words. And so that's definitely one of the most important scenarios where actions speak louder than words. And that action has to come from within the company and from within with those managers. It sounds like Ubisoft has, moved a lot of people out to make room for new leadership, which is, a refreshing of leadership is sometimes what you need to make sure that you can reinstitute and reintroduce a new kind of culture and make sure that's maintained from there on out too.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about some lighter subjects now. What are some of your favorite games of all the time?
So my go-to answer for this one, and it's funny because anytime anybody's onboarded at IGN, we always introduce them to the company and then we ask, what's your favorite video game? So mine is Final Fantasy X. And there's a very specific reason for it. It's very personal to me because at the time, so I got a PS2 as my first and only console, and it was a sympathy gift because I had undergone a spinal surgery at the time, and I was very young. So it was difficult. And my aunt gave me, I think it was like, a Best Buy or something, gift card. And my brother managed to use that to get me a PS2, which was really nice. So I think I was supposed to get books with it or something, but I think that was her idea. But, he got me a PS2 instead. And one of the first games that I got alongside it, because he brought it to me with a package of other games, was Final Fantasy X. And so, here was this, I love RPGs in general. And the more fantasy, the better, as far as I'm concerned. So that's Final Fantasy X is just the perfect. It's RPG with tons of fantasy and fictional lore and interesting characters. And I love the companion aspect to it too. I love when you're a protagonist, but there's other companions that are constantly with you. So something like Dragon Age is very up my alley as well. So Final Fantasy X was this game that I played while for about a month or 2 months I was bedridden, so like couldn't move. My mom had to help me brush my teeth, to that degree. But here was this big open game where I could, fly in an airship and then go play blitzball and, fight all these creatures and visit all these different worlds. And at the time, the graphics were insanely impressive. Actually, to this day, the cinematics are still very gorgeous. And they even have, a space where you can go and replay cinematics because I think they knew that they were, very gorgeous cinematics. So it was such an immersive game, and it just completely enraptured me. And it felt like, they say a video game is for escapism. And I think in that moment, I definitely needed that level of escapism, and it's exactly what it provided for me. And so I don't think any other game can measure up to that experience just because of the escape that it offered me, and the quality of the game as it was at the time and in reflection. Like, I think they remastered it and they brought it out to Vita, and I replayed it on Vita as well, and it still held up. It's in a nostalgic way, but also just in a how the RPG functions, how the story unfolds, some of those magical elements that I really love. So I would say that's my all-time favorite game.
This is just beautiful. This is the beauty of video games, that it
Mm-hmm.
really takes you away from everything that is happening around you, especially during these hard times that we're all in our houses. This is crazy. So, what other games? What
Yeah.
recent games?
Recent games. Well, Red Dead 2
Yes.
was my favorite game of, what was it, last year? I can't keep track of time anymore.
I think it was 2 years ago.
2 years ago. That's right, because I'm remembering our Game of the Year awards, and last year it was Control, which I loved also. So 2 years ago, my favorite game was Red Dead 2, although I think we awarded it to God of War at the time instead. Yeah, I think that was the case. But so Red Dead 2 was just, I love Rockstar in general, and loved Red Dead 1, was very excited about Red Dead 2. And for Red Dead 2, they introduced the concept of the Rockstar world, which on surface level, you're like, okay, so you're an open world game. Like, what does that mean? But what it means is Rockstar level details in an open world RPG. And we already saw that in Red Dead 1. So it's like, oh, you're only just now introducing this concept? What does that possibly mean? And it meant like so much exploration, so much beauty. I think like they really nailed a lot of these narrative sequences where you're semi-participating. I don't want to spoil too much, but there's, a scene where you're stumbling around coming out of a bar, which is interesting. And then there's another scene based around a house, which I won't, dive into too much, but it's, yeah, there's such simple scenes, but it evokes such a human element from it. And I think Rockstar is really great about thinking about the level of detail that needs to go into something, or the level of charm that needs to go to something. And then also when to roll those events out at a point where you're like so enthralled and so invested. On the flip side, I loved the original Last of Us. And The Last of Us 2, I really enjoyed. Because there's so many elements that were similar to the Last of Us 1, and I'm a big stealth gamer as well. So like any challenge in the stealth realm, I'm like, yes, I can do this. So I really liked that aspect of it. But there were certain parts of the way that they told the story in The Last of Us 2 where they relied on flashbacks. But I felt like I was getting certain flashbacks at the wrong moments where I couldn't appreciate them. And they only made sense long after, which I know is also like, a movie storytelling technique, but it didn't land for me, because I didn't know characters or I didn't care about them. And so by the time I had this revelation moment, I was like, wait, who was that character? Like, I couldn't really follow their thread because there were a lot of new characters introduced in too. Whereas when they were related to Joel or Ellie, obviously I knew those characters from the first game. So there was a different level of connection that I had. And I think Rockstar is really good about reading how their players are playing through and what feelings they may have at what moments. And so therefore, when is most impactful to introduce, this simple house scene, or this simple bar scene. It's the pacing was, even though the first few hours were brutally long in the snow levels, and it's like, all right, when is this changing? After that, though, the pacing was perfect. Once you kind of get over that hill. So it's clearly my running theme is clearly like narrative stories, but also narrative stories that aren't necessarily about the story itself, but how it's told, how the characters unfold in front of you. And the gameplay obviously has to be substantive enough to where it's carrying you through that part of the story too. And in that sense, the pacing in The Last of Us 2, where it was introducing new enemies and then eventually kind of a boss type of enemy, which is a bit new for that franchise, was a new introduction that was that definitely carried me through that part of that game at the very least.
Yeah, how do you see the Rockstar without Dan Houser?
Yeah, it's hard to say, because, remains to be seen. Like we need to see a game to really see how it comes to fruition. But it's interesting because, as someone who's so close to her brothers, like I can't imagine what a fundamental change that must be, to the structure of how things are done, because, siblings can be so close and can make decisions so in lockstep with one another. And, you could be so dependent on that other person's point of view. Who knows if there's like a yin yang kind of scenario that's balancing that decision making out. But at the same time, I think there's a certain point of time where too much consistency can also lead to complacency. And so who knows if that refreshing, or if that does introduce a refreshing of leadership, of perspectives, of values, of what you might want to be pursuing as your goals. It's will be interesting to see, what GTA 6 or what Red Dead 3 looks like, and if you can see the differentiation, because obviously the Hauser brothers have led a lot of the creative impact, and they've been very hands-on with the games. So it'll be interesting to see how that actually comes out into play, literally, in the future.
Okay, your favorite video game company?
So I mentioned Control, and which came out last year and was IGN's Game of the Year. So if I had to pick, I would probably pick Remedy, because they're just so wildly creative, and by that I mean it's unexpected. Like it's like a lot of their games are like fever dreams, and even if they're missed the mark on some of them, like I don't think Quantum Break is popular as some of their other games, but they have this element of clearly an interest in horror, which I love horror, but not so scary as like a Resident Evil, which I don't think there's a Resident Evil I've ever finished. Gotten close on 7, I think, but none of the others I've been able to finish because it's too scary. But when it comes to like Alan Wake or Control, there's a horror element to it for sure, but it's more in the context and the framework of the story and some of the characters that they introduce. It's more dread than like fear, I guess. And so there's something that I've always liked about that balance of like magical creativity, but also like a clear interest in horror, and just completely new, different concepts. And Alan Wake, he's a writer. It feels a little bit like The Shining, kind of a context. So there's a relatability to that too. But I've just always been fascinated at their brains, and then obviously what they're able to pull off as well. Like I thought Control was really graceful, as opposed to like Alan Wake is much more slow paced and slow and then fast when you have confrontations. But with Control, there was something really interesting about the exploration of the Bureau, but also the unfolding of the story and just the grace, frankly, of the combat. I felt so graceful and powerful, while I was experimenting with different loadouts, essentially, of my abilities and my guns and the different combinations. So I mentioned earlier, like I get really attached to one set, but in Control, I was swapping around quite a bit. So I thought that was pretty impressive that they broke me out of my own shell, because I wanted to experience everything that they had created. So Remedy is definitely up there. And then I should also mention Playdead, who made Limbo and Inside. And those are games that are so simple in concept, but so complex in retrospect when you really think about what they pull off, both technically, and I won't make any spoilers around Inside, but there's a thing that happens at the end, if you're aware of, that's actually, kind of a technical achievement that's really impressive. But it's also like the narrative that they're able to tell with basically no words is really impressive, and it's always really sucked me in. And I do kind of like that they're more concise games, they're shorter experiences, but man, do they leave you thinking about it for a very long time. So ultimately it feels a lot more substantive than some other games that might be 100 hours long, meanwhile.
Yeah, obviously you're into story-driven games and games with great atmosphere.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, if you're going to be spending a lot of time in it, you want to be motivated, essentially, while you're there.
Yeah. So, your favorite person in the video game industry?
Oh, favorite person? That's tough. But I guess I'll cheat and use.
You can have multiple.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so favorites are always tough for me in general. Like even favorite color, I'd sit here for 30 minutes and basically at the end arrive to why every one of the colors are amazing. But which is true, which is honestly, my answer is just rainbow. But without to cheat by using my younger gamer self, Suda51 was somebody that I always loved because he's another crazy mind, in a creative, really beautifully creative way, and fun and wacky way. And borderline weird in moments, but like I love Lollipop Chainsaw. But obviously, like all of his like horror inspirations too, like there's a clear horror theme with me. So a lot of those things that he injects into his games Like loved the first No More Heroes. I've been a little bit delayed on the other ones, but he's definitely a great brain. But if you have all the stars too, like the Miyamotos of the world, like there's so much respect. I think there's just so many people that you can respect out there that have so much talent. But there are even executives too that are leading their companies in really responsible ways. I think it's been really impressive to see like how much Xbox has listened to their community. They went from the always online internet basically faux pas of the introduction for the last generation to this time around they're being so much more open-minded. I think like Phil Spencer's always been like a very genuine voice on stage, on camera, and I think it shows in the actions of like what the company is trying to do, which is bridge a huge gap in terms of their competition, which is definitely a steep one. But I think maintaining to some philosophies and not necessarily, diving to some of the cheaper things that people can do to try to remain competitive has always been like a good philosophy that I've noticed as well. But there's a long list of creators out there, and a lot of who've become friends of mine as well, which I always disclose, if that ever comes up. So it's something that I think is a growing list too, especially as younger developers are growing under leadership and then being put into those positions of leadership, having the opportunity to become the creative director of a longstanding franchise and add their own stamp to it. So it's generally a very big growing list of people, and always exciting to meet everyone and hear everyone's philosophy, even if sometimes it doesn't always result in the best thing for them. Like Sean Murray comes to mind. I met him once or twice in person, and my first conversation was about No Man's Sky, and I have a big piece on Kotaku about it. Obviously irrelevant now because it was a preview piece from E3, so no new information or anything, but I loved the conversation with him. He was so open and so transparent. I felt like I was learning from him too. Like I felt like I was really getting in his head for what he was designing around that game. And obviously that, I think he has some regrets about the open communication that he had and his transparency. And it's certainly a fine line to balance, because ultimately, you're not one person speaking to another singular person who totally understood where he was coming from. You're one person speaking to another person who's then publishing something that tens of thousands of people are seeing, and then a bunch of other people are doing the same. And some of that direct charm and some of that direct understanding gets lost when it's a couple quotes that people are pulling ultimately, and that goes up on Reddit or that goes up on Twitter, and then it turns into, oh well, you said this thing back then. And it's tough out there to be in the spotlight in the industry. But I've definitely met people like Sean that were just fascinating to speak to, because there's so much about games that I can appreciate just as a critic, and then there's just so much about games that I wouldn't know unless people like yourself told me about it and gave me an opportunity to appreciate not only how difficult some of the achievements are, but some of the process that goes into it. Gives you such a different appreciation for like, wow, look how beautiful this is, that every world has different colors that have different evolving creatures. And like, how did you technically create that? Oh, you created a whole system, an algorithm on your side that was producing these things. Like, wow, that's amazing. You didn't just use another tool from Unreal Engine or whatever it is. Like, there's a level of knowledge that comes from that gives you exposure into what it's like and like what the difficulties are. And then when you see the final product, you're like, wow, I understand. I felt like I was there with you when you were creating it.
Yeah, very interesting. I wasn't expecting Soda 51 from you. I love that guy. I always wanted to talk to him, but yet again, I don't know Japanese. So, but his last game, was it Travis Strikes Back or Travis Strikes Again? I love that game. He's crazy. He's making something. It was very, very different. I like that game.
Mm-hmm.
I had so much fun on Switch with that game.
It's funny because horror can often, not that game is about horror, but just that his pedigree is often in like horror elements. Horror is often really serious, but then when you look at horror overall, there's actually so many subgenres of horror. There's like metal horror, there's comedy horror, there's like more conceptual horror, there's like more theoretical horror. Like it's a whole like cascading level of different subgenres in there. And I think like his work has transitioned a little bit away from those like classical horror elements, but he's always never been afraid to just be goofy and have fun with things and just sort of be expressive in that way. And I think it's, great for him, in the same way that a lot of other people recently have come come off of AAA studios, created their own kind of like independent fields, and been able to create work cultures that emulate, what their priorities are. And so I think it's really interesting to see some of that play out in games, and like what creativity comes out of it as well.
Yeah. So next one, Ryan Mccaffrey. I just wanted to give a shout out to him. His IGN Unfiltered is something very inspiring for my own podcast.
I'm so glad. Yeah, he loves that series. He obviously gets to meet a lot of really interesting people, and bring interesting topics across. Because I think a lot of times when certain developers are going out on the road and they're doing their press tours, there's very specific press beats that they're trying to accomplish within a marketing strategy. But Ryan really wants to get at the person's career, their background, their inspirations, and that kind of fluid conversation really is fascinating, and might not result always in the those big, we had Jim Ryan say this thing about PS5 and it makes a headline and then it goes everywhere and explodes and the traffic is insane. It's not always about that, but I think it like connects you. And I hopefully, from the other side, makes the interviewee feel more connected as well when they're able to talk about something a little bit more personal that doesn't necessarily have a specific marketing beat in mind. And it's really just about having a real conversation. I think probably a lot of people feel like that's lost in the current generation of media coverage, where everything is about like that breakout and that headline. And, who else is picking up on that? So were you the first to report it, et cetera? Like, obviously, those are big priorities. It's how the business is run. But at the same time, we always try to make sure that we have room for those kind of deeper conversations and those interesting conversations. We actually have a series on our features side for guest editorials, and we bring in developers. We brought in Kiki Wolfkill, who's another favorite developer. She's just an amazing woman, like has an amazing career, came from race car driving to development, which is it's just incredibly fun and fascinating. But she came on board as an example and wrote a guest editorial about her experiences in the industry. And it wasn't talking about Halo, and it wasn't talking about anything, maybe quote unquote newsworthy, but she was expressing, what it was like for her growing up in the industry, maturing in the industry, and what it was like for her when she was, finding mentors and being a mentor to other people and other women in the industry. And like, those are the kind of stories that you get when you're unchained by the news wheel or the marketing wheel, and the kind of like real connections that you can make. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, all of these companies, all of these games are just made by big groups of people. And it's nice to remember that sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm learning from Ryan. Actually, it's always more interesting for me, at least, to talk about personal things with game developers. For example, when I was talking to Ken Levine, we were talking about politics. We were talking about religion, and I've learned a lot of things about his games and his personality, and people were like, "Oh, why didn't you ask about his next game?" Like, that doesn't matter, man. That comes later.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think people are appreciating the kind of like the personal opinion of the game developers that much. So yeah, thank you, Ryan.
I mean, game developers use a lot of that research and that information in other fields of work as inspiration for game development. Like, a lot of game developers say, if you want to be a better game developer, learn about art, learn about science, take anything that isn't game development, learn about that, and have that be an inspiration point. And I think Ken is very well versed. He's actually one of the first people that I interviewed in my career as well. And I found it a fascinating conversation because he has that wealth of knowledge. And of course, the experience in the industry. He's seen a lot of transitions in the industry as well. He obviously created a franchise that a lot of people find to be a big staple of the industry now, myself included. So I think there's a lot to learn about even just the previous games people worked on, not necessarily what they're working on in the future. But of course, we always want to know that too. We want to know what the future looks like, and especially with the next generation of consoles coming out. One thing that we did at IGN was ask a bunch of developers, what is the purpose of next gen? What's the big hook to next gen? What does 12 teraflops in the Xbox Series X mean? And what it means is, okay, well, you can render better dynamic lighting, and there's like elements of immersion you can achieve because of the higher fidelity and like the higher processing power, and so you can put more detail, and you can render more people on screen, and so there are bigger crowds, and smoke looks more realistic, so you can like use that as cover and make it really feel like you're in the battlefield and covering behind smoke and whatever else. And so those things and knowing what to expect is always useful, especially if you work in the industry or in the industry that reports on the industry. It's always good to know. And of course, there's the curiosity from, such a great designer as Ken Levine to wonder about what they're working on. But there's so much to hear about the past as well, and like what inspires them from the past too.
Exactly. So what are gaming websites you check on as a gamer?
So again, this is one of those questions where it's more my job and my role. I of course still read Kotaku, where I used to work, and it's the site has changed a lot in the sense of a lot of the staff members when I was there are no longer there, and the company has changed a lot, and I think that informs why a lot of the staff isn't there anymore. But the culture at IGN or the writing culture at IGN is still always been very much about community reporting as well. I think it's a lot of where I picked up on a lot of that stuff too. So I've just always really enjoyed reading the more, because we're very thorough when it comes to coverage. Like here's every trailer, and here's, all these preview beats, and we have the resources to do that kind of thing. Kotaku is a smaller outlet, so they pick and choose, and they really put their opinions into things. They put their personality into things. So I find it an enjoyable read. And then there are the other sites. Like I love Eurogamer's reporting. I think they're one of the sites that actually break the most news. So I always make sure that I'm keeping an eye on that as a reader, because I want to know about breaking news, but also as, an industry professional that wants to make sure I'm checking all my bases and I have everybody and every piece of news in front of me and in front of our team too.
Great. So favorite game of the year so far?
Favorite game of the year so far might be Ghost of Tsushima. I don't often finish games, which is maybe a shame of myself as a gamer, because I'll get distracted and there's so many games and you want to jump to the next one. And I want to keep up with like movies and TV shows and reading and everything. So it's a lot to keep up with. But Ghost of Tsushima, I felt very compelled to go from start to finish. And it wasn't that I felt that I needed to. Where there were moments in The Last of Us 2 where I thought like, oh, well, surely I'm close to finish, so I should just, rough this out and finish this game. But with Ghost of Tsushima, I wanted more by the end of it too. And I think aside from it being an absolutely gorgeous game, and I think it might be the most gorgeous game that I've seen this generation. And it's strictly to do with, the fall leaves and the snow and the thunderstorms on top of it. Just the environment was really gorgeous. But I liked the combination of, embedded in the story, the idea of right and wrong. Cause I'm very much about that. I have this very specific moral compass. And I think that, comes with a lot of Persian culture also. Like there are right things that you do and there are wrong things. And so I liked that that's also a Japanese culture thing. And so I loved that, the main character, Jin, was exploring what that means for him, because he's headed in this new direction. He doesn't want to go against his uncle. There's a specific choice that you make at the end of the game that I was biting my teeth over, or biting my fingernails over. So I think, that was really interesting. And I loved that it was a different environment to explore, a different culture to explore. I experimented with sometimes in Japanese with subtitles and then other times with the English voice actors. But I loved that. And I loved that it was evocative of, those samurai movies as well. All of the style and the emphasis that comes from it. It was an amazing experience. And as a game, there's a lot of stealth involved, even though that's kind of, a morally bad thing to do in at least samurai culture. But I love stealth. So I did a lot of that and found that actually that was another one of those games where I was swapping my samurai stances and styles quite a bit, as opposed to, just being married to one option and just playing through an entire game that way that I mostly would do in other cases.
Yeah, about the culture of things. Yeah, exactly. Sometimes I was like, just hug it out, man. You don't need to kill each other.
I know. Yeah. And and that's what's so great about it is it's so complicated. Like, that there's love there, his uncle loves him as well, but their moral compass is really pushing. And I think that's actually there's something to be said about the moral compass being too confining. Like there's a right and wrong in terms of what you're following in there as well. And I'm watching The Boys right now alongside everybody else. And There was a moment where, I don't know if you're watching the show, but
Yeah,
there
I'm
was a
watching.
moment where a character, yeah. So in the last episode, I'm so bad at remembering character names. It goes in one ear out the other. But one of the detective that's or the FBI agent or whoever that's working with them, the blonde woman, short
Yeah,
hair.
I know.
Yeah, and she was saying something like, about right and wrong, and she was saying that that there's sometimes doing the right thing isn't what you should be doing. But I think she misinterpreted in that instance what the right thing was. And I think you always and same goes for Ghost of Tsushima, and this is getting really philosophical, but same goes for Ghost of Tsushima. They're right and wrong isn't always black and white, and it changes with context, and you have to consider who you are, who your values are, who the other people that might be impacted are, what their values are, what you might be doing to them in the process of whatever decision that you're making. So it's just, I love those complex kind of conversations. And to go back to BioShock, I think BioShock introduced some of that, or tried to introduce some of that. Maybe didn't pull it off as effectively as people would have liked, but the fact that it left you with something to think about and theorize over, I think that's one of the most compelling things any piece of media can do, is make you think about it afterwards and want to talk about it. What did you do? What did you think? To get the comparing competitive theories on those things. It's a great way to be left off of a piece of media.
Yeah, Ghost of Tsushima is my favorite game of the year so far too. And do you think games going to be shorter in the future? They are too long right now.
Some of them are too long, which is often why I won't finish some games if I'm not truly, truly invested. I think that there are a lot of gamers that still want that really long experience. And to kind of go back to a previous point where we can't assume, as media outlets and representatives, we can't assume what a gamer, a reader's situation might be. Maybe they're only buying one game a year. Maybe they can only buy one game a year. And so they want to buy the game that's like a Red Dead 2 that they can spend so much time in and it still feel fresh months afterwards. And then there's, Red Dead Online that comes associated with that. And so they're seeing the value of being able to spend so much time with one game. So I think there will always be a camp of people that want that 100+ hour RPG with an online component, or just to play Destiny, for hours on end every day. With their friends. There's different value to a long game or a multiplayer game with, one more round kind of a philosophy. But I think the smaller or the shorter games that, a company like Playdead makes, I think there's something so valuable about that experience too. And I think as we're seeing more independent companies being formed, and more consistency and stability of that as a potential career path, I think we're going to see more concise games that I think there's, a big burgeoning amount of people who, have kids and don't have time, and they have to wait until bedtime at 8 p.m. before they can even start a game. And so they want to be making progress too. And they want to be able to experience a game from top to end and have a full narrative and be able to talk about that full narrative. So I think there's definitely value to both. And as we see more companies working outside the bounds of some of the AAA guidelines, developing and becoming successful, I think we'll see more of those shorter, that sweet 5 to 10 hour long game, that sweet spot of that kind of experience is one that I'm always happy to have, to be able to burn through and experience a lot of them at a time.
Yeah, we should have short games too, like short films, like half an hour game. That would be awesome. Nobody's making them.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, there are business decisions around it, and some people will greenlight a game based on if you're pitching it to a publisher or something, people will greenlight a game based on that shelf life value. So there's the unfortunate business realities around something like that. But I think you could argue, some multiplayer games are kind of technically 30-minute games, because if you just play one round, that kind of counts. Or, simple mobile games, or something as simple as Sudoku or, Scrabble or whatever else, those experiences too. There are those short bursts of entertainment as well, just for the train ride home or whatever it might be.
Yeah. So a game you can't wait to play, and Cyberpunk is not allowed.
I was gonna say Cyberpunk though. That's not fair. Yeah, I mean, it's tough to say. I'm trying to remember what's coming out the rest of the year, because Cyberpunk is obviously the one that's top of mind, and then obviously the consoles coming out are top of mind as well. What are we in October? So, I'm not sure. I know that well, like there was one game that we not debuted, that we showcased on Gamescom that's coming out later this month. Ghost Runner, that looks like,
Yeah.
like a crazy neon experience. We had this is a good one. We had a preview event recently around Watch Dogs, and I played the first one and then I skipped the second one, just because of conversations that were going on around at the time. But I'm very interested in Watch Dogs 3, set in the UK. I think like there's going to be really fun NPC engagements based on what they're saying and like based on what we're seeing. So that's one that's definitely on the radar. I think both of those come out later this month. And then I was a big fan of Devil May Cry. I know they're coming out with like a remaster of that. I'm not sure if that's something that I would replay. And then Assassin's Creed is coming out this year. I'm like on off with Assassin's Creed, but like I'm one of those that believes like Black Flag was a crazy great introduction. That was a little bit of a shift for Assassin's Creed, because it's definitely possible to fall into that trap of just the Assassin's Creed formula, and you're playing kind of the same thing over again. But it sounds like Valhalla will be interesting as well. And then of course Miles Morales too. That's still slated for this year. I think that's going to be a big, even though it's kind of attached to Spider-Man PS4, it still feels like it's wholly own experience. And I think Miles Morales has been getting good attention just in the comics world in general, in the Marvel world in general. So it'll be fun to see what they do with that character in that game. And the most recent showing of footage from Spider-Man Miles Morales looked pretty as well. So it seems like a pretty one to engage in at the very least, with that same fluid, fun combat too.
Yeah. So a game that you want to have a sequel.
To a little bit cheat over, I would say Alan Wake 2 would be pretty amazing.
Good choice.
Yeah, because there's just so much in that kind of environment, that setting, that you could explore with. And I love the experience at the time. So it'd just be a fun excuse to revisit it. I think that's honestly what Red Dead 2 for me was. I didn't even need it to do anything better than Red Dead 1. Which it did do. It introduced something very new, but it was something that I wanted to revisit. Absolutely. So I'm trying to think of other one-off games. For whatever reason, I was randomly thinking about Sleeping Dogs the other day, which technically is not, a true crime game. It started off as one, it turned into Sleeping Dogs. Would love to see a second one of that game, because I have a lot of fond memories playing that one.
Do you think they're ever going to continue?
Yeah, it did. Yeah, I mean, that's the formula of the industry, is that you usually, if a game is doing well, there will be a sequel. But there's so many franchises out there and so many other business impact decisions that who knows what the processes are. But yeah, I remember loving Sleeping Dogs quite a bit too. But it feels like a lot of other things have sequels.
Yeah, and I was thinking, this generation I played Vampire. Did you play that game?
I haven't, but it intrigues me. I know that there's been some hiccups recently with some preview builds and whatnot for Bloodlines, but it still intrigues me. It seems the trailers have looked good at the very least.
The Vampire from Don't Not.
Oh, I see. Yeah. No, I haven't.
That's an awesome game. I want to see a sequel on that. That was.
Yeah, I thought you were talking about Bloodlines.
I'm sure you're gonna love it.
Yeah,
awesome story, awesome atmosphere. You're gonna love it.
Yeah,
check it out.
Yeah. There's like everyone, I have a giant back catalog of games that one day in the future maybe I'll be able to tackle, but we'll see. Maybe with Xbox's backward compatibility. Yeah,
it's on PS Plus right now. So, the most inspiring woman in the industry for you?
I brought up Kiki recently, but I think there's just so much. There's so many other women. This is like the favorite developers category, but I think there's so many women out there that have dove into really big leadership positions. So really anybody that's kind of like in those substantial leadership positions that are able to impact culture and decision making are inspiring, because there's just so many of them. It's not as the running joke is that it's still a very male-dominated industry, which in some senses I think is true and is something to be reflective about. But there are a lot of people that have like gained these really impressive positions. Like Amy Hennig obviously has a lot of pedigree as well, and I think that's something that's worth respecting, simply because it's amazing to reach those levels in the industry where you're kind of a household name. And Kiki is also in a lot of ways a household name. And I think there's a lot of independent developers that are emerging in those fields too. And it's just always good to see people find their own space, and it doesn't always necessarily have to be in those big executive roles, as long as they're impacting something that's important to them, essentially.
Yeah. So now please take your time and talk to the female listeners of this podcast. What do you have to say to them?
I mean, the question that I always get from younger people who are looking to get in the industry is how do you get into the industry, essentially? And I think that's, a universal question. So it's really about the perseverance of making connections and fine tuning your own skills. So whether it's in the media industry, in my industry, where you're developing your voice like I was, or you're developing your editing skills, or if it's in development and you're whatever department of the development world you're in, and constantly looking to pursue your skills in that field. I think that's the big thing that I always focused on, and tried to, as much as possible, block out some of the external feedback. Because certainly if you're in the spotlight at all, there's always going to be criticism, whether it's founded or unfounded, fair or unfair. And I think that, there's a level of thick skin that you have to have. And part of that thick skin is blocking out those voices, not letting them get to you, and focusing on the things that you want to improve, taking in the criticism that feels productive and constructive, and then ignoring everything else and sort of accepting the internet for what it is. But at the same time, what I was speaking to earlier, in the sense of like calling things out and standing up for the right and wrong of things within your own comfort level. A female developer, a friend of mine, a while back had told me, she's an independent developer. She had told me, it's important not to feel like you need to be the activist in the way that other people might feel like they're the activist, saying something on Twitter, or, putting together a speech or a talk at GDC or whatever it is. That might be other people's style, but it's important not to feel forced into that position. There are ways that you can impact culture that don't necessitate putting yourself under the spotlight, essentially, because it is exposing yourself and becoming vulnerable to a lot of open criticism. And that might not be something you're comfortable with. So I think it's about finding your own voice, whether it is in media or not. Your own voice means how you write, how you express yourself, but also how you express yourself to the public in a video game, in that creation, or to your colleagues. So it's about finding that comfort zone and just remaining true to that. And then, finding the people and the company where your voice is not just appreciated, but it's also reflected back, where they have similar philosophies. So finding your space. So it's the discovery of yourself, and then the discovery of other people, and finding where that aligns so that you can be supported to do whatever creative avenue you're working on, essentially. So there are the questions of, how do I get in the industry? Well, you keep consistent with your contacts, you constantly work on your trade, on yourself, and you're building your portfolio, all of those things, of course. But then there's the, maybe how do you survive in the industry is the other question that people don't always ask, but I know are thinking. And that comes to that expression and that discovery, essentially.
Yep. Tina, you're a Wonder Woman. Thank you so much for being so kind, awesome, and inspiring. Your entire career is education, and your personality is something I wish to see more in the industry. You're a powerhouse. Thank you so much, and have a beautiful day.
Thank you. You too. That was very kind of you. And thank you for having me.